Hello, welcome to the online lecture for Anthropology 102. Sorry this is a little late, but as they say, better late than never. So today we're going to be having a lecture on subsistence. Hopefully you got a chance to see the NISA video already and have a picture of what a foraging subsistence pattern might look like, but we're going to talk about a variety of subsistence patterns and how people make a living around the world. So how we define subsistence is how people support themselves, and there's a variety of ways that people do this. And it's not just about finding food or providing food for yourself, but there's a variety of basic human needs that people are making that people need to meet when they're engaging in subsistence. So food, by all means, is important, but also water is very important as well. And other macronutrients, so there's certain minerals. People need so many carbohydrates, so many fats in their diets, protein, vitamins, all sorts of things that the human body needs to be able to maintain itself. And you know the saying, if you go 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 days without food, and you're going to be in pretty bad shape. So it's not just about getting calories in your body, although that's definitely important. But people also need medical care when you get injured or when you get sick. Humans are really good at taking care of one another. Shelter, by all means. People die from exposure and hypothermia with some degree of regularity, so humans need some protection from the elements. We also need to bear and rear children, and if you take another class from me, you'll understand that rearing human children is definitely a communal event, and it's very difficult for single parents alone in the wild to raise children without any sort of aid. So we have to meet needs when it comes to bearing and rearing children. Stimulation and variation is important for humans as well. One of the much debated techniques of extracting information among inmates at Guantanamo Bay or providing discipline is to deprive them of stimulation, so placing goggles over their eyes, earmuffs over their ears, and mittens over their hands. And many human rights activists consider this to be cruel and unusual punishment because when humans are deprived of stimulation, it can have negative psychosomatic effects. So stimulation is important. Socialization is important. Interacting with other human beings. Another often debated disciplinary technique is isolating individuals from all their contact with other humans. So putting people in isolated units also has been shown to have some negative psychological impacts as well. And finally, some aspect of self-control or control over their own lives. So feeling extraordinarily stressed or helpless also causes negative health outcomes and can even cause death in some cases. And so while all of these are important, they're not met the same way in every culture. If you've ever traveled somewhere else, you know definitely that the food is different, the type of medical care can be different. If you've gone to another country and slept on a different bed, you know that the beds are different and child rearing practices are different. Although all these constraints need to be met, different cultures will meet them in different ways. And we're going to talk about kind of 4 overarching themes when it comes to subsistence. And it's important to understand each of these themes so that when we are talking about some of these other human needs or human behaviors, we can kind of get a picture of how different subsistence methods can structure how people meet these needs. So we'll talk about each of these in detail. So let's start with foraging. Many of you probably have some experience foraging in your lifetimes, and that's just collecting wild foods through gathering, hunting, scavenging, or fishing. And wild foods are foods that the production and reproduction of those species is not controlled by humans. So going and picking berries in a berry patch in the mountains, if the berries weren't planted by humans and they're not irrigated by humans, these are wild foods that people are collecting. Also, fishing in rivers and streams and lakes that aren't stocked. This is foraging for wild foods. And the difference between hunting and scavenging is that hunting involves actively looking for killing and butchering animals for consuming them, And scavenging is locating and using animals that are already dead. Um, and then, of course, fishing as well as collecting wild foods. So, so let's look at what a foraging lifestyle might be like if you were to only be foraging. That was the only way that you were meeting those basic human needs. So you're not growing plants like agriculturalists, and you're not buying food with money like industrialists. Foraging societies today are generally generally located in marginal areas, and that's mostly because other types of subsistence strategies, like agriculturalists, have kicked them out of all of the places with high amounts of rainfall, lots of vegetation. So most of the foraging societies that we see remaining are in areas like the Kalahari Desert, where basically no one else wants to live. However, people being really smart and also highly dependent on cultural knowledge can make quite a nice living out here. Because in these marginal areas, resources are widely dispersed around the landscape, so there's not a high amount of resources in any one area, at least not consistently. So sometimes a grove of, for the kung at least, the mongongo nuts will come into season. But generally food is widely dispersed around the landscape, meaning that people tend to exist at low population densities. So we don't see foraging societies living in city-sized encampments, for example, unless, of course, they've been forced there by colonizing factors or state governments or something. Historically, they've lived dispersed across this landscape, and they'll the size of the group will change over the course of the year, and I'll show you a slide in a second. But mostly people tend to stick together in extended family units, and they'll come and go as resources allow. And these groups tend to be egalitarian, and what this means is that adults at least have relatively equal political power within the groups. We don't see any sort of caste system. We don't see slaves and masters. We don't see a class system. We don't see hierarchical political power like a president or a chief or even a big man. Adults tend to outrank kids. They can tell the kids what to do, but adults oftentimes can't tell each other what to do. So these societies tend to be egalitarian. And these societies have been, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention that these societies are also mobile usually as well. People don't make permanent encampments. They will move around the landscape in what we call a seasonal round, exploiting resources at different locations throughout the year to really take advantage of all the resources that the landscape has to offer, and that's how they make a living. So, a lot of these societies are called or nicknamed the original affluent societies because although they don't accumulate a great deal of material wealth, like jewels and gold and furniture and cars and these kinds of things, their workload is relatively low, especially compared to industrialist societies. They tend to only what we would consider work about 4 to 6 hours a day, and this is mostly spent collecting food. Now, this doesn't mean they're not caring for children, cleaning, preparing food, bathing, taking care of these other basic human needs. But the amount of time that they spend at least collecting food in order to support themselves is very low compared to the amount of work that people in industrialized and especially agricultural societies spend on subsistence-related tasks. So they have a fair amount of leisure. The other nickname for these societies is ecologically noble savages. And of course, in this anthropology class, we know that with a culturally relativistic point of view, we would never call members of another society savage simply because they had a different way of making a living than we do. So I'm going to avoid using terms like savage and primitive and barbarian. We don't, as anthropologists, we don't use these words. But this is a historical term, and it refers to the fact that decision-making among members of these groups about how to extract resources is usually extracting fewer resources than the environment has to offer. And that's because individuals are acting efficiently. If you live in a foraging society, you have little storage, you don't have refrigerators, so you can't preserve food for very long, so it doesn't make sense to collect more than you need. And so we often see these individuals in these societies making sustainable lifestyle decisions in terms of making sure the environment can reproduce itself, merely because it doesn't make sense for them to collect more food than they need, or more materials for making clothing or tools, that kind of thing, than they need. And this usually results in a sustainable lifestyle, even though this is not their goal. So oftentimes foraging societies have a sustainable lifestyle only because exploiting the environment more than they do is simply not worth their while. So let's talk a little bit about movement, and we'll get into some more specifics about foraging societies. As I said, individuals living in a foraging society make what we call a seasonal round of occupying different camps, and these are 3 different camps we might see individuals occupying throughout the year. So in the bottom left, this might be the first camp, and the camp will be located where the triangle is in the middle of what looks like a flower, and each petal might be a daily foraging trip. So individuals live at the camp. Each day they go out on a foraging trip, they go out, they come back, they make a round trip, return with some resources, some nuts, some starchy roots, perhaps some game, maybe some leafy greens or some fruits. And once they've exploited all of the area around the camp, it doesn't make sense for them to go extra far. It might make more sense for them simply to pick up and move camp, and then they would move up to the camp in the upper left for new resource patches. Perhaps there's a different season now and something over here is growing that they couldn't access before, and they'll move between these camps in a seasonal round, very efficiently exploiting the environment. Members of foraging societies have a lot of local ecological knowledge about how to exploit their environments, and many times they've informed biologists about things regarding to animals, and botanists with information about local plants that the scientists wouldn't have had without the deep ecological knowledge that these people have about the resources. So they're not wandering aimlessly. They're very specifically moving these camps to areas of resources. And as they move camps, they also have what we call fission-fusion dynamics. So fission is breaking up, and that's the process you see going from the 100-sized group. They break up into the 50-person size groups and then into the 25-person size groups. And the fusion part is coming back together. So these 25 groups might meet up and become a 50-person group, and those 2 50-person groups might meet up and become a 100-person group again. Why is this occurring? Well, sometimes it's due to resources. Certain seasons might have an abundance of resources that allow a large number of people to come together and live in one area. There might be enough plants or animals available at that time of year. Sometimes it's religious or ceremonial circumstances. Sometimes it's both. The religious or ceremonial events occur around times of abundance so that many people can come together to celebrate them. There might be several reasons. Rainfall is also important if there's enough water to support a large number of groups. But oftentimes people split up and come together. Both can the environment support this number of people in the landscape, and also it's based on kinship and social relationships. So who do you want in your group? What kind of group are you going to join? If you're fusioning, you're coming together in a larger group, you have a couple of options. Who are you going to join up with? And oftentimes this is determined by kinship or other particularly important social relationships. One mechanism for maintaining these relationships is often exchange, so trading things with other people to cement those social or kinship relationships. And if you've read the section on the Dobijuwansi in the cultural sketches, the Dobijuwansi, Kung San, these are all names for roughly the same cultural group. You understand how important exchange is to them, and how if you've read the Eating Christmas in the Kalahari paper, also talks about how ritualized and important giving can be to people whose social ties and groupings rely on mechanisms of exchange. So people have been living this type of foraging lifestyle for as long as human culture goes back. And so even if we take this back to, we say, modern humans, we see the first modern humans on the landscape about 200,000 years ago. They were foraging societies at that time, but we really don't see human culture getting started, human culture the way we know it, with lots of artifacts and ritual symbolic items like beads and art and that kind of thing, until about 50,000 years ago. So really what we would recognize as a modern foraging society. We have a great example of this site in Starkar, England. It comes from about 11,000 years ago. It's a settlement on the shores of a former lake. It's been filled in with peat, so peat's anaerobic, meaning that all of the organic material, like wood, has been preserved because there was no oxygen, so it couldn't break down. And we have excavated this 700 square foot wooden platform on the edge of the lake, covered with reeds, that probably housed about 4 to 5 families. And you're thinking, how would I get 4 to 5 families in my 700 square foot apartment? Well, people were probably only spending part of the day here, possibly just at night, sleeping by campfires. But you can see from the evidence we found, a variety of activities took place here at one point or another. People were hunting, they were fishing, they were gathering wild plants. You can see them making clothes and tools. Here's the platform, here's a ceremonial headdress made from some antlers, some fishing spears. But these societies, they don't have hierarchy, they don't have taxes. There's no writing. A lot of the things that we take for granted in our industrial society just aren't present in historically foraging societies. And even many modern foraging societies don't have these institutions in place, even though we wouldn't say they're any less, civilized than ours. They're just a different type of making a living. So you've seen the video on Nisa, or Nye. I'm not very good at doing the clicks. Hopefully you have a good feel for how this group of individuals makes a living and how that's changed over time, especially now that they've been forced into reservations, essentially. Women tend to spend a lot of time gathering foods, and you can see here they're carrying their children out as they go out on a collecting event. Why carry your kids? Well, it's really easy to get lost in the Kalahari, so this is one of the best ways to keep an eye on them. Men spend a lot of time hunting for foods, and hunting and gathering, or hunters and gatherers is kind of a different way of saying foragers, are really complementary activities. One, gathered foods tend not to have a lot of protein, and that's a required macronutrient for human survival. But gathered foods are pretty reliable. You can reliably bring in a decent amount of calories by collecting plant foods and digging up tubers and collecting nuts and fruits and these kinds of things. And hunting is very unreliable. So every once in a while someone will shoot a deer or a giraffe, but it doesn't happen very often. And so it's good to complement the reliable gathered foods with the less reliable, higher calorie content, with protein and higher fat content foods as well. And it varies in terms of the contributions of hunted and gathered foods from foraging society to foraging society. And this is another reason why exchange is so important to individuals in these societies, because if you did catch something like a giraffe, you know that without storage or refrigeration, the meat will spoil fairly quickly. And because it's so unreliable, if you share your meat that's probably going to spoil anyway with your neighbors, the next time someone else catches a giraffe, they're going to share with you. So exchange is really important to members of these societies, and we'll have a whole lecture on exchange later on in the semester. Now, these societies also participate in a fair amount of exchange with their agricultural and industrial and pastoralist neighbors as well. But we should also look at another example of a foraging society, because we know that foraging societies existed on the northwest Pacific coast as well. And if you look at these pictures, they look quite different from the lifestyle of the Kungsan in the Kalahari Desert, and that's because in these areas there was an abundance of resources. The salmon run, lots of local plants available, and they could support a higher density of people in one area, so higher population density. And because there was a higher population density, we also see hierarchical organization among these societies. We had different classes of people. There were slaves and slave owners. There were special ritualistic activities occurring. So we know that if we were able to study foraging societies that weren't forced or left in marginal habitats, we might see differences occurring other than what we can mostly observe today with the remaining foraging societies still existing in the world. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, let's talk about horticulture. Horticulture is another type of subsistence activity, and it involves growing crops with simple tools and methods without permanent fields. This can also be referred to as swidden agriculture or slash and burn agriculture. But the difference between foraging and horticulture is that people are actively promoting the growth of plants in their environment. And you can see here a horticultural field in the Amazon, and we would call this a garden. You can see they're growing some maize here. They've also got some structures set up for vines. They'll grow a variety of root crops usually, because root crops can't be eaten by wild animals. They'll grow some fruit trees. They'll grow bananas and manioc and other types of fruits and roots and vegetables. But people actively play a role, although a reduced role compared to agriculturalists, who we'll talk about next. And the garden size is usually limited by the amount of labor in a household. So these small fields are usually created by families who will eat the produce that's grown in them. They're tended by families. And what people have to do is clear a section of the forest, usually tropical forest. Most horticulture occurs in tropical areas around the world. They have to clear the fields. Usually they'll burn off the plants that they've cleared. This will put some nutrients in the soil. Horticulture often occurs in areas with very poor soils. Tropical soils tend not to have a lot of nutrients in them. They'll plant the crops, they'll do a little bit of weeding, and then they'll basically check on them every now and then to see, what's come up. There's no irrigation, there's no use of pesticides. It's a very kind of low-key, shall we say, way of farming. And there's a variety of ways that people do horticulture around the world. Some more widespread than others. These chinampas were limited to Mesoamerica, and they're basically floating gardens. People created these fields and flooded areas with channels between them, and they would plant crops on these flooded fields. They'd basically let the crops grow, and they'd come back when it was time to harvest. Swidden agriculture is the most common type of horticulture that occurs, and you can see here a field that's been cleared for swidden agriculture. So the trees have been cut down, they've been burned off to put some ash and some nitrogen back into the soil, and then people will come through and plant these. And after they're done planting, after they're done harvesting the crops, they'll let the forest retake the area, and they may come back in 20 to 50 years once the forest has regrown and the soil has had a chance to regenerate, and plant the area again. But the horticulturists, as I'll show you in a couple slides, also tend to move around quite a bit as they finish using all of the forest close to their village. They might move the village and use a new place for cultivating their crops. We also see terraced gardens, and these make use of steep surfaces or will take advantage of sudden moisture, like in the American Southwest. So they're planted on hillsides, so when it rains, the runoff is caught on the flat areas and the crops grow, and then the dry season, these areas tend to be neglected. But again, it's, do a little bit of preparation, plant the crops, maybe a minor amount of maintenance, and then come back and check on things when they're done. So the 3 points to keep in mind about horticulture, and I'd prefer you to know each of these 3 points that I'm giving for all the different subsistence strategies, is that it occurs mostly in tropical zones. Compared to foraging, we see higher sedentism and population densities. Sedentism is how long people stay in one area. So these villages do move, but they will move much less often than foraging camps. Foraging camps will maybe be located in several areas within a year, horticultural villages who participate in a horticultural subsistence strategy tend to be in one place for at least several years, and then once they're done using up the local area, they might move to a new location. So the villages do move fairly often, oftentimes 5 to 20 years, depending on where people are located. And because horticulture produces more calories and nutrients per acre than foraging does, they can support higher population densities as well. So as you can see here, we have a Yanomamo camp. It's an ovular shape, and the roof is over several apartments. You can see the wooden posts in the dark area, and between each set of wooden posts would be the apartment for one family. So we can have fairly large numbers of individuals living in these camps, and then within these villages, and then within the central area you'll have activities like food processing and that kind of thing occurring. Also in horticultural societies, we see some hierarchy. Again, we don't have chiefs and presidents, but we often have what we call big men. And we'll cover all of these different hierarchical organizations later in later lectures also. But big men are basically individuals who are able to persuade others. They have no official title, but they're able to convince others to do things for them. So they have some political power. And this is Anka from Anka's Big Maka, and he's trying to organize a big feast, and he does a pretty good job. And you can tell he's the big man because he has the big man fancy hat. But he's a really amazing persuader, shall we say. So there is some hierarchy. Some individuals do have enough influence to tell others what to do. Okay, and here's the, how movements of the Swidden system might go. You might locate your camps in year one, your fields in year one in various locations, and you might move them between different seasons. And once you've kind of exploited the local area, you move your village elsewhere. And one place that we've done a lot of study of horticulture besides the Amazon is in Papua New Guinea, which is an island roughly north of Australia. And this society is the Dani here, and they are on the island of Irian Jaya, and they are groups of horticulturists who are known for their war, farming, and pigs. So they do horticulture, they raise local crops. They also have slightly domesticated pigs that individuals own, but they let running loose throughout the local forest, and when it comes time to have a feast, they'll go and find their pig, and they'll slaughter it, and everyone will have some pork, and it's a great day in camp. Because population densities are higher, and because horticulture does take a large amount of land, I mean, you have to have essentially small farms that you move every so often, a lot of times these societies are in competition with one another for access to land, so we do see a fair amount of warfare here, and you can see at the bottom an individual on a lookout tower making sure that no one's coming for a raid. The other thing that the Dani are known for, and you can see in the upper right picture here, are their penis sheaths, and these are covers that go over the penis that can vary in length and width and decoration, and it's one way that in the society you can be fashionable and or intimidating. Let's see. The Dani are interesting also because they weren't, in air quotes, discovered by the outside world until 1933. And if you want to look up a YouTube video called First Contact about the Dani, you can see the reactions of these individuals meeting white people for the first time. And because in their spiritual beliefs, the ghosts of their ancestors will come back with pale or white skin, you can see the shock on their faces as if they really were seeing the embodied deceased ancestors coming back to life. However, interestingly, they had been indirectly exposed to Western culture. You can see this man wearing the Kellogg's biscuit tin on his head. So some artifacts had come to them, even though they had never actually seen white people before. And so these people are organized into groups of about 1,000 each. There's about 50 separate groups, and they make up about 50,000 people total. And each group has very well-defined territories. and they are constantly trying to expand and prevent the expansion of others through small-scale warfare. Okay, so let's talk about agriculture. Agriculture involves the use of permanently cultivated fields. So unlike horticulture, where the areas under cultivation are moved regularly, and there's not a lot of, compared to agriculture, there's less labor inputs. Agriculturalists have permanent fields that they cultivate year after year, and the use of domesticated species is much narrower than horticulturalists. Horticulturalists in each field will have a variety of crops. They also make use of a lot of wild resources as well. Agriculturalists tend to depend on fewer domesticated species, like having rice make up the majority of the calories in your diet. And this increases the amount of production, so you can get a larger number of calories from an acre of rice than you can from a field that's been planted for a horticultural society. However, there's also a greater risk if a disease or a drought or some other factor comes through and wipes out your field. You pretty much have nothing else to rely on that year. So we'll talk about this in a second, but because we have increased production, we also see among agricultural societies increased population densities. And the other thing about agriculture is that animals are often an important part of agricultural systems for many reasons, one of which is that they can increase labor inputs. So you can use an ox or a bull or a cow or a donkey or a llama to pull a plow or help cultivate a field or transport goods. And people also depend more on animal protein for their protein inputs, so they're raising more domesticated species for meat and milk production as well, because they're not relying on hunted wild species, because they've cultivated all of the areas around where they live and there's no wild species near where they live a lot of times. So the 3 points to remember about agriculture is that, one, it's a lot of hard work. And that's why we call foraging societies the original affluent society, perhaps, because agriculturalists tend to work long and hard hours producing food. And they're also prone to food shortages. So we see a lot of ritualistic activities associated with agricultural societies as people attempt to prevent food shortages, because agricultural societies, being dependent on fewer types of food, are more at risk when one type fails. Because agriculturalists have permanently cultivated fields, they are also sedentary. So they will build their village or household in one place near where they're cultivating, and they won't move them oftentimes ever. So you see the castle here is located near the fields, and the castle is going to stay there. They're not going to move the castle anywhere. And agriculture, because it produces surpluses of foods overall, it can support state-level types of organization. So we can see division of labor. Some individuals might be involved in producing the food, and then we might see religious specialists or manufacturing specialists who are creating products that are exchanged for this excess of food that can be produced by any one individual. So it's not you're producing what you eat. You can produce more than one person actually can consume, and that will provide for other types of activities. What this means, though, is we often see organizational castes or hierarchy. So some individuals can have a lot of power over the lives of other individuals, and that's quite clear in this picture here, where we know that the lords of the castle can exert power and influence over the individuals who might be involved with working the fields. Because we have an excess of produce overall, we also see political complexity, as I just mentioned, and trade. So individuals can afford to pay middlemen to acquire goods from elsewhere and bring them to where your sedentary society is. So this is a picture of camels on the Silk Road, and as if you remember from, I think it's 8th grade, feudal societies also were involved with trade to other countries, oftentimes far away, and so we see the Silk Road occurring for the first time with the advent of feudal societies. So my favorite example of an agricultural society comes from traditional rice agriculture in China. And this is a great example of a village making use of every aspect of the surrounding area. So we see the village on the far left here. You see the arrow pointing to the village pond. And what happens is the well-watered rivers and stream valleys with monsoonal floods flow down from the mountains. So those triangular peaks there. And the water flows down through a variety of areas. I'm sorry, there you can see the village at the top of the stream. Near the village, with the crops that need to be harvested fairly regularly, we see the vegetable fields. We also have plantations of mulberry trees here that will help stabilize these slopes. Then those streams flow down through the rice paddies, all those boxy looking things. And as they travel right towards the beach, we see the water buffalo ponds where they keep the water buffaloes, and the duck ponds, and the fish ponds where they keep the cultivated fish. And finally into the sea where the oyster farms are, and the inshore and offshore fishing. So every aspect of this water system is used in one way or another, and it's so productive that they can produce 2 and sometimes 3 crops of rice in a year. And the last thing to notice is that you see these burned areas on the hillsides. They even will burn the hillsides frequently to release the nitrogen from that ash, which will then flow through and fertilize the whole system. So here's a representation of individuals in this traditional rice agriculture in China on the right here. So the system can be highly productive. You get high population densities, and you get sedentary societies as well, often with hierarchy and political complexity. Okay, so let's talk about pastoralism. Pastoralism is kind of in its own reign because it's not, it's not sedentary. Although these individuals who are pastoralists can amass great amounts of wealth, because their subsistence is based on the care and tending of animals, they usually have to be quite mobile in order to constantly find water and fodder for the animals. So these individuals are making a living from their herds of animals, and they're not just keeping, a couple of dairy cows on their farm. They're essentially running a mobile dairy that they move about the landscape, although there's much more to it than that. So you see some examples of pastoralism here: a gentleman with his camel, a Maasai with his herd of cows, and an individual with a reindeer. And we see pastoralists distributed across the world with large-bodied, domesticated grazers. So reindeer in the north of Russia, sheep around the Mediterranean, horses in the steppes of Asia, camels around the Arabian Peninsula, and cattle in East Africa. And in the South America, we also see alpacas and llamas domesticated. And these animals are called domesticated because their reproduction is controlled by humans. So humans decide which animals get to breed, how many are breeding every year, who's getting fed, who's going where. So humans are essentially controlling the lives of these animals. 3 points of pastoralism. Pastoralism also tends to take place in marginal areas, and that's because these herds can convert unusable resources like grass into usable animal products like meat and milk and wool and dung. And these marginal areas may be able to support enough grass for these animals to live on, even though they wouldn't. And groups will often convert these animal products into sometimes considerable accumulated wealth. And because they're mobile, they often participate in trade between agriculturalists and other agriculturalists, between foraging societies and agriculturalists, between other pastoral groups. So they're often involved with trade. And they can vary quite a bit in terms of organization, from loosely organized tribes to almost state-level societies. So if you think of the Mongols of Central Asia under Genghis Khan, they're highly organized with extensive hierarchies. So it varies quite a bit from group to group. There are two main types of pastoralists. Most pastoralists are what we call nomadic pastoralists, meaning they move around a variety of areas. And kind of like foragers tend to have a seasonal round where they occupy different parts of the landscape during different times of year. And then we also have pastoralists like the sheep herders here in Idaho, and we refer to them more as transhumans pastoralists, meaning they have the summer pastures and the winter pastures, and the herds are moved back and forth between the two, and not in a larger a movement pattern across the landscape. Managing your herd is quite a feat of cognitive strength. Managing your herd composition and size is very similar to managing a portfolio for the stock market. You have to consider the age, the gender, the type, the number, and the location of each of your animals if you want to maximize the use of your herd. So you're concerned with how many younger animals you have versus how many older animals. Obviously, you want to be able to maintain a stable herd size over time. You might imagine fiddling with the proportion of females to males, since the females are the breeding animals, the ones who can have the babies. So you might prefer to have more females than males. You might increase or decrease the size of your herd depending on the rainfall that year. You might balance your portfolio between higher risk animals like larger bodied animals such as camels and lower risk animals like goats who can reproduce faster. And also, you're not only moving your herd from location to location, but a lot of pastoralists will divide up their herds and send different portions of their herds to different areas at the same time in case rainfall is better in one area than another, or if there's local disease or something like that. And there's also a lot of social factors involved with managing your herd as well. What's your status? What grazing rights do you have? Who are your kinspersons? Do you have, nieces and nephews and sons and daughters who can take different portions of the herds elsewhere? So it's a big thing to manage the composition of your herd. And the herds do have to be moved quite often because there is no natural pasture in the world that can support an animal herd year-round, and we're talking large numbers of grazers. So availability of pasturage, rainfall in different areas, temperature, disease, and the local political situation also determines when and where and how often you stay in one area. As I said, pastoralists take a variety of products from their animals, meat, obviously, but also milk products, blood. The Maasai will take up to a quart of blood from an animal once a month, and the animal can completely recover from this, and they'll use it to make different types of dishes to be consumed. You can also take the skin and the hair of the animals, such as shearing sheep and yaks. These can be made into clothing and shelter, and also their dung can be used for starting fires and as cooking fuel. So one group of pastoralists that we've talked about fairly often are the Maasai in East Africa. They herd the cows for their milk, mostly, but they also take blood, and when they're managing their stock portfolio, they often will kill animals of the wrong age, the wrong sex, to help manage their portfolio, and so they'll consume the meat as well. And oftentimes they trade these animal products with agriculturalists and foragers in the area for animals that they can't produce. For items that they can't produce from their animals. They have 15 primary territorial groups, and they're quite hierarchical. The elder men have most of the political authority, and status and wealth is determined by the number of cattle owned and the grazing rights that you've inherited. More grazing rights, larger herds, more status. And they're polygynous, meaning that if they can support multiple wives, they'll marry multiple wives. How you acquire a wife is paying her family a certain number of cattle that's agreed upon, and this is to compensate her family for the loss of her labor, because the women are the ones who will process all of the animal products, such as the blood and the milk. So the cattle are given as gifts, and in return you can acquire a new bride, and as many brides as you can pay for and support, that's as many wives as you can have. Okay, so just take a moment to pause the lecture here. I'm going to ask you about this when we meet for class again on Tuesday, and jot down a few notes about what subsistence strategy you think you would most likely to be a part of. Would you prefer to be a forager, a horticulturalist, a pastoralist, or an agriculturalist, and why you choose this one? And which would you least like to be a part of? And so you know they all have their costs and benefits, so come with a list of costs and benefits of which you would like to be a part of and which you wouldn't. Okay, I think we're going to skip this last part of the lecture for now. It basically says, well, why doesn't everybody be an agriculturalist? Our own industrial society is semi-agriculturalist. It has an agriculturalist history, so why not everybody? Well, and why don't we see all of these different types of subsistence patterns going back to 50,000 years ago? These are some reasons of why people became agriculturists. Well, maybe they're giving big feasts and they need to produce more food. Maybe there is a lot of people on the landscape and they need to keep up with population pressure. Maybe climate change to make agriculture possible. Maybe large animals that ruin your crops all went extinct. But there's a lot of reasons not to do agriculture. Once you get larger amounts of population growth, and we definitely see this among horticulturalists, you get more conflict. Conflict grows as population densities increase. Environments can become degraded and no longer producing crops. And people living together give each other diseases. So we often see decreased health, like tuberculosis, otherwise known as consumption, cavities, sexually transmitted infections like this is a brain on syphilis. We also see nutrition deficiencies as people are only eating a few number of domesticated species, so they can become anemic and get other types of developmental stress. So here's just a chart if you want to pause and look at it longer of foraging versus agriculture. We talked about these a little bit. So let's talk. The last thing I wanted to mention today was cultural ecology. And so we might ask, why do we see these different subsistence strategies on different landscapes? As I mentioned, they all have kind of different areas of the world that they tend to occupy these days. And it's because subsistence strategies really depend on the interactions between human cultures and the environment. And we'll have a whole lecture on cultural ecology, but I want you to start thinking about this. The environment that you're living in kind of can tend to limit the options available to you. What types of stone are available to make tools? What types of wild plants and animals are available to be domesticated? How much rainfall is there? How much can the environment locally produce? So a cultural ecological perspective is where humans' behavior depends on interactions between culture and the environment. And as we've kind of alluded to, the subsistence strategy that you have also can affect things like mate choice. How many wives can you take? Can the environment support or have multiple wives or multiple husbands, large multi-spouse families? How sedentary can you be? What are your residence patterns going to be like? What are your systems of exchange going to look like? Is there hierarchy? What are your political norms going to look like? And a lot of these things go back to the type of subsistence pattern you're following and the type of local ecology. So we'll talk more about that later. On Tuesday we'll have Subsistence 2. We'll discuss some more details. Feel free to rewind and look back and fill in your notes anywhere that you've missed them. Jot down some questions for me so that we get back together and lecture on Tuesday. Hopefully I can answer some of your questions. Okay, that's all for now. Look forward to seeing you next week.